At its absolute peak, Atari was worth more than $2 billion and controlled 80% of the entire home video game market. Then, in less than 3 years, the company lost over $500 million and nearly took down the entire gaming industry with it. That collapse is still studied in business schools today. And the reason it happened is far more complicated and far more fascinating than most people realize. In the next 10 minutes, you are going to discover how a single company invented an industry, dominated it completely, and then destroyed it through a combination of greed, arrogance, and decisions that seemed perfectly logical at the time. We will walk through the full arc of Atari's story, from a garage in California to a billion-dollar empire to a cautionary tale that echoes through every gaming boardroom to this day. And there is one chapter in this story that almost nobody talks about, because it reveals something genuinely uncomfortable about how success itself can become the deadliest trap. Atari was born in 1972 in Sunnyvale, California, founded by Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney with an investment of just $250. The name itself came from the Japanese board game Go, where Atari describes a position of strategic advantage. That choice of name was not accidental. Bushnell was obsessed with the idea of capturing a position so dominant that no competitor could easily dislodge it. He had already been experimenting with arcade games, having created Computer Space in 1971, which became the first commercially sold coin-operated video game. It was a commercial disappointment, too complicated for casual players, but it proved that the technology was viable and that Bushnell was thinking in the right direction. The breakthrough came with Pong. Released in November 1972, Pong was almost insultingly simple. 2 paddles, a bouncing dot, a score counter. Nothing more. But that simplicity was the point. Bushnell had learned from Computer Space that people needed to pick up a game and understand it within seconds. Pong delivered that instantly. The first Pong cabinet placed in Andy Capp's Tavern in Sunnyvale broke down within 2 weeks, not from any mechanical failure, but because the coin slot was jammed with quarters. Demand was that overwhelming. By 1973, Atari was producing Pong cabinets around the clock and generating millions in revenue. An entire industry was being built in real time, almost by accident. Throughout the mid-70s, Atari expanded aggressively, but the real game changer arrived in 1977 with the Atari 2600. Originally called the Atari VCS, or Video Computer System, it was one of the first home consoles to use interchangeable game cartridges. This was a revolutionary concept. Previously, home game systems played only the games they were built with. The 2600 turned the console into a platform and turned games into a software business. Consumers could buy the hardware once and then keep purchasing new experiences indefinitely. That model, hardware as a gateway to an ongoing software revenue stream, is the exact same model that Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo still use today. Atari invented it. But here is what nobody talks about when they describe this era of success. The 2600 almost killed the company before it ever found its audience. The launch was considered a failure by most industry observers. Sales were sluggish throughout 1977 and well into 1978. Retailers were skeptical. Consumers were not sure they needed a game machine in their living rooms. Atari was burning through cash and Bushnell was pushed out of the company by Warner Communications, which had acquired Atari in 1976 for $28 million. Warner brought in corporate management, stabilized the finances, and made a decision to hold the course. That patience paid off in ways nobody predicted. Space Invaders changed everything. When Atari secured the exclusive home license for Taito's Space Invaders in 1980, it became the first killer app in gaming history. Consumers were buying the 2600 specifically to play Space Invaders at home. The console went from a curiosity to a cultural phenomenon almost overnight. By 1980, Atari was generating $2 billion in annual revenue. By 1982, it was responsible for a third of all of Warner Communications' profits. The gaming industry had exploded, and Atari sat at the center of it. And then came the decisions that unraveled everything. In 1982, Atari paid $50 million for the rights to make a home version of the arcade hit Pac-Man. The port was rushed to market in time for the holiday season, given only 5 months of development time. The result was widely regarded as a disaster. The game looked nothing like its arcade counterpart, used a flickering graphical technique that made characters nearly invisible, and replaced the iconic soundtrack with tinny bleeps. Atari manufactured 12 million cartridges for a consumer base of 10,002,600 owners, assuming non-owners would buy the console just to play the game. Returns flooded back. Consumers felt cheated and began to distrust the Atari brand. But that was only the first blow. Later that same year, Atari released a home adaptation of Steven Spielberg's E.T. the Extraterrestrial, a game developed in just 5.5 weeks by a single programmer named Howard Scott Warshaw. The game was so confusing and poorly designed that players could not figure out the basic mechanics without reading the manual multiple times, and even then the experience was punishing and joyless. Atari had again manufactured more cartridges than there were consoles in homes. When returns came in by the millions, the company had no answer. The legend of the New Mexico landfill, where Atari allegedly buried millions of unsold cartridges in the desert, was confirmed by an excavation project in 2014 and became the defining symbol of corporate overconfidence. What made the collapse so severe was not just the bad games. It was the loss of consumer trust across the entire market. When Atari failed, retailers stopped stocking all video game products from every company. Parents and consumers concluded that video games were a fad that had run its course. The entire North American video game market contracted from $3 billion in 1983 to $100 million by 1985. That is a 97% collapse in 2 years. Atari had not just damaged itself. It had nearly extinguished the entire industry. Here is the deeper insight that makes this story genuinely instructive. Atari did not collapse because it lacked talent or technology. It collapsed because its success created internal pressures that made quality almost impossible to maintain. The company was shipping so many products, managing so many licenses, and answering to a corporate parent focused on quarterly earnings that the culture of craftsmanship that had built the brand simply disappeared. Programmers were denied credit for their work, leading the developers of the massive hit Adventure to rebel by hiding the first video game Easter egg, a secret room containing the programmer's name, inside the cartridge. That detail tells you everything about the relationship between Atari's management and its creative talent. The people building the products felt invisible and undervalued. Nintendo rescued the market in 1985 with the Nintendo Entertainment System, deliberately distancing itself from the Atari brand by marketing the NES as a toy rather than a game console and implementing strict quality licensing controls that prevented the flood of low-quality titles that had defined Atari's decline. The lessons of Atari were baked into Nintendo's business model from day one. Every quality seal on a Nintendo cartridge was a direct response to the Atari catastrophe. Atari continued to exist in various forms through the late 80s and 90s, releasing the genuinely innovative Atari ST computer line, the technically impressive Lynx handheld, and the ambitious but ultimately failed Jaguar console. But the cultural moment had passed. The company changed ownership. Multiple times, fragmented, and slowly dissolved into a brand name that has been bought and sold by various holding companies ever since. Today, the Atari name still appears on products, but the company that built Pong and the 2600 is gone in any meaningful sense. What Atari leaves behind is a legacy that is simultaneously a triumph and a warning. It created the home video game industry. It demonstrated that software could be sold as a consumer product, that games could be a legitimate form of entertainment, and that technology designed for play could generate billions of dollars. Before you go, if you learned something valuable today, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to Pixel Pulse for a brand new video every single day. We will see you in the next one.